Welcome everyone to today's seminar, which will be about Arctic climate and environment. What are the challenges we face? And we will have some examples from the Norwegian research. Of course, not all. My name is Aarseth, and I sit in Tromsø, north of Norway, and work at the Norwegian Institute for Bioeconomics. This picture shows you the glacier that's protruding into the fjord of Kongsfjorden at Svalbard, and this is in August. And this is one of the glaciers that are also melting and disappearing slowly, sometimes rapidly, and are only growing a little bit extra during each winter. But in total, the glacier is disappearing. I will come a little bit back to that. We can start with the Arctic Ocean. You see here. There. Start with the Arctic Ocean. As you all know, the ice in the polar ocean Arctic Ocean is disappearing slowly. And Norwegian research are focusing not only on looking at the extent of ice and the volume of ice, but they are also looking into how the Arctic Ocean is used and how that will affect the climate. You maybe have heard about the Northeast Passage, which is a sailing route, goes from Europe, north of Norway, north of Russia, through the Bering Strait and down to Asia. This route is being used more and more by tankers and other ships. And the route is very interesting for international shipping because you save 14 days by going this route instead of going the old route through the Mediterranean, the Suez Channel, and this way to Asia. China is now, as you know, interesting because the economy in China is growing very rapidly. But you're saving 14 days. You don't have to pay the fees in the Suez Channel to get through, and of course now pirates is not a problem anymore, but they were for a short while in the Horn of Africa down here. The reason for this route being used more and more is that it's possible to use it because the ice in the Arctic Ocean is disappearing. And the length of time that you can sail is increasing by every year. Approximately now from August to November, December, there is so little ice in these areas that you can pass through this without any problem. And of course, if you have a tanker that goes in this area, where you have very shallow water. It's very shallow water north of Russia, and you have to be very careful. And the tankers are escorted by Russian icebreakers, which also function as medical ships and rescue ships. So we're not talking about very high volumes of ship at the moment, but they are increasing very rapidly. And we look into how this will affect the Arctic Ocean because these boats have something called bulk water, and bulk water is water that big ships take into their tanks to stabilize the ship. So sometimes the boat have a lot of water in its bulk tanks, and sometimes little, depending on how much load the boat has altogether. The problem is if you take in water in, let's say, Mediterranean or out in the coast of England, you also take in a lot of species with the water, zooplankton, plant plankton, and other species. If you release bulk water in the Arctic Ocean, which they do, there are some rules for this, how far from the coast you can release it, but if you release it, you also release these species or animals, zooplankton. Since the temperature of the Arctic Ocean is increasing, there is a concern that these species would maybe survive in the Arctic Ocean. So then you have introduced new species to the area. That's not a problem if they survive. The big problem is if they reproduce. If they reproduce in the Arctic Ocean, you might have an extreme big challenge to the Arctic and ecosystems. The reason for this is that the typical Arctic zooplankton contains 30% of fat of body mass, meaning that they are extremely important for the rest of the food chain. Fat is gold in the Arctic because it's high density in energy, and it can also be used for insulation. The zooplankton, maybe coming from Mediterranean or south of England, contains only 10% fat of body mass. So if these species would be competing out the Arctic species, then the Arctic food chains have a big problem. So looking into how the introduced species from bulk water can survive in the Arctic Ocean due to increased water temperatures. Also, when the ice are diminishing, the length of the ice edge is also shrinking, and it is along the ice edge where you have the most life in the Arctic Ocean. If you go into the ice, the further into the ice you get, the amount of species goes down. And the reason for this is that on the ice edge you have a physical barrier between open water and ice, which will mix the water. This is a physical oceanographic principles, which will mix water and get more nutrients up to the surface, and therefore there are more species there because you have possibilities for several food chains. So that's also something we look into, are the amount of species and the abundance of species going down because the ice edge is shrinking. One important thing, as you might have seen, is that you can take a picture from a satellite, and that picture will tell you exactly where the ice is and how the ice is kind of shrinking, not covering that much of the Arctic Ocean anymore. But that will not tell you the most important part, which is the volume of the ice. You can have a smaller area of ice, but the volume can still be the same. So Norwegian researchers are now trying to compare and using mathematical and physical models to take special images from satellites that will tell you about the density of the ice, and they hope that these mathematical models will also make them able to calculate the thickness of the ice. To test this out, they take pictures of a certain area of the ice in the Arctic Ocean. They go down with helicopter and use drones to measure the thickness, and then they test this in the end in the same area physically by just drilling in the ice. And they're trying now to make mathematical models to make them predict the volume of the ice, which is important. Let's look a little bit about how Arctic research on climate and the environment are important in the societal loop. You can have some kind of driver in the society. It could be industry, it could be a climate change in itself, but it can also be a human activity. These drivers have some kind of an effect on the ecosystem, the status of the ecosystem, and the effect of the ecosystem. The research, Arctic research, are concentrated on these yellow boxes. What do the drivers, human drivers, climate drivers, environmental drivers do to the ecosystems of the Arctic? And if you get an answer which is positive or negative, of course it's not so nice to get both, because then you don't know what direction you should go in. But if you get an answer, you assess if this is a gain, loss, ecological, economical, ethical, societal, and you tell the management about this. The management are closely related to the politicians, as you know, and the politicians should then take sound decisions to affect the drivers to decrease the effect on the ecosystem if it's negative. Of course, this is the difficult part because the drivers are making money, and when you have money, then you have a problem of getting the industry to adapt. So, in all preservement of Arctic environment and how to stop the climate change, the problem is money, and this you know. When you have an increased water temperature, you will have northern migration of fish species that are more adapted to cold water. Herring is a very good example. Herring, the northeast Atlantic stock of herring, which is 4 to 7 million tons. That's enough to all people getting half a kilo, all people on Earth getting half a kilo of fish. And this fish is very rich in fat and is now migrating northwards. Another problem about northern migration of fish species is that if, for instance, a fish species that is fished upon by Englishmen or by Dutch people are migrating into Norwegian waters, who own this fish now? Who can fish this fish now? So this is another problem which is related to societal effects. These 4 to 7 million tons of herring are eaten by whales. This is a picture of a humpback whale that goes up to the surface and can eat 150 kilos of herring in each bite. And the last 5-6 years outside of Tromsø, this herring has been going into the coast during October, November to January and overwintering in the fjord. When you have 4 to 7 million tons of one fish species that wants to enter a fjord, you have several problems. First of all, the only fish you get in this fjord is herring. It's not possible to get cod or other fish species, which the fisherman has a quota for. So the Norwegian government are very interested in how does this northwards migration of herring affect the structure of the Norwegian society along the coast. Because when the cod is migrating northwards, the fishing boats, which are sometimes small, cannot reach the cod anymore. And the Norwegian government wants to answer how can this how will this fishermen, will they now move to the city? Will they buy bigger boats? Are they able to buy bigger boats to reach the cod? Because the herring quota is quickly fished up. No, the humans are very adaptive, as you know. So the humans or the fishermen, they just start with whale tourism instead. So they start with taking tourists out on boats to look at whales. And in this period where the herring is occupying the fjord, they are going with tourists instead of fishing. So they have the same income. So they have adapted. Just to illustrate how much herring it is in the fjord during these months, the salmon rearing station, you know that the Norwegians rear a lot of salmon in these nets. All the salmon died in this fjord of oxygen lack because the herring took all the oxygen in the fjord. And salmon is needs a lot of oxygen during its rapid growth. So they have to move the whole salmon station outside the fjord, which is very both expensive and a critical movement of the total station. So it has effect on this climate change, and northern migration of fish has effects of this total society. We also look at effects of climate change on sea and coastal ecology in the north. And in Norway, we have an extremely long coastal line. If you draw it out, it will take you 1.5 times around the equator. So the Norwegian coastal line is extreme. We have a lot of seabirds, which are both reproducing in Norway, but also on Spitsbergen, Svalbard, which is Norwegian territory. And this example of the Arctic skua, which is reproducing on Greenland, the east coast of Greenland, and on Svalbard, has been tagged with light loggers. And light loggers are small loggers weighing 5 grams, which are attached to the feet of the bird, which detects the amount of light during the 24-hour day. And if you know the date and you have registered the amount of light during this day, you know exactly where you are on the Earth, because this changes with latitude. And which is interesting is that the Arctic skua, when it's not reproducing, it's, well, you can see with the yellow dots here, which are individual birds, you can see that they are going all the way down to Madagascar the rest of the year. So if this bird is haunted by climate change or are looking to be extinct, you have to cooperate with a lot of different countries to save this bird. This is just an example from one seabird. You can make maps like this for a lot of birds. What we see is that cod larva is extremely important for where the seabirds adapt their or situate their colonies. In this map, which is showing you the north of Norway, you can see the seabirds colonies with the black circle dots, and you can see the concentration of cod larvae. And the more cod larvae, the more red the color is. So they are, especially in this area here, which are very big colonies of seabirds, well functioning. They are very high concentrations of cod larvae. In this area, you see, we know that these colonies are getting smaller and smaller and will in a few years disappear because the cod larva concentration, the cod larva in this area is now very low. We are now looking into changes in the sea currents due to changes in water temperature, which will affect the life along the Norwegian coast. So we are looking into how climate change, increase water temperature, and changing currents, not only big change, but small change could be enough, will also lead the cod larvae further away from the coast, which will then again affect the seabird colonies. If you look at terrestrial ecosystems and changing climate, we have one good example with birch moth attacks. The birch moth, it's a larva. Let's get to a gray look. Should have a picture, of course, but looks it's a butterfly when it's adult, and it's gray, and it's camouflaged into the birch. The problem is that the eggs of the birch larva or the birch moth survives minus 35 degrees. If the temperature is lower than that, the egg die. But the last years, 5 years, the temperature of the inner parts of North Norway hasn't been minus 35, probably again because of climate change. So these larvae has been increasing in number exponentially. And you can see that by dead forest, because they eat the leaves on the birch, and the photosynthesis of the tree then stops and the tree dies. In this satellite map, you can see big areas of forest in Norway, North Norway, which are dead and killed by the birch moth larva. Also here you see the trees are dead. They are brown. Some green trees which are not attacked between this. But this is a typical example of how climate change can affect the birch forest in the north. And we are looking into how quickly the birch forest can regain from such an attack. And this has been a problem the last 5 years, as I mentioned, and was not a problem 10 years ago. And probably this is because, again, of climate change. Permafrost, you've heard about that. That's permanently frozen ground, which are now disappearing. And in the soil of the Arctic areas, you have enormous amounts of nutrients from historically dead plants and animals, which are stored in the ground in the permafrost. It's like you have a freezer. You store your food in the freezer. You freeze it down so no microorganisms can attack it or eat it. If you pull the plug of the electricity to the freezer and you open the freezer 3 weeks later, you know that something has happened there. Because then the microorganism has started eating it, the food there. The same thing will happen if the permafrost disappears. Then you will have access, all plants, organisms, animals will have access to enormous amounts of nutrients stored in this permanently frozen ground. So this will affect the total ecosystem of the Arctic, leading to plants that migrate northwards, new plants, new animals, new predators, total different ecosystems. And we are looking into the areas where the permafrost has started to disappear and how the ecosystem changes in these areas. If we look into hazardous substances, which we humans have released since the Industrial Revolution, we, as you have, of course, noticed that we have some problems with plastic. India is responsible for 60% of the plastic pollution to the ocean. And we have registered, and this of course is because the huge rivers of India, people throw plastic into the rivers, the plastic disappears, they are happy, and the plastic goes out in the big ocean and ends up in the Arctic. It ends up all over the globe. And if we look at Fulmars on Svalbard, in 1984, there was a big research project detecting how many birds contain plastic. That could be plastic around the feet, could be plastic in the stomach, could be plastic around the head, wherever the plastic was situated. 29% of birds of Fulmars contained plastic in 1984. The same project was repeated in 2014. And then we saw that 88% of birds now contain some kind of plastic. So the increase in plastic pollution is dramatic. And then we talk about bigger plastic parts, as these birds clearly died by eating plastic. This is stomach. Also, this is a puffin which tries to feed their chicks with plastic. So big plastic is one problem. Another problem, which we don't know too much about yet, but which is possibility catastrophic, is the microplastic, because plastic parts will be slowly deteriorated to small parts of plastic, which could be actually eaten or mistaken by food by zooplankton very low down on the food chain. And I will show you a film about that now. This was a movie that was made by Norwegian authorities to clean the coast. And if the animals, zooplankton, on the bottom of the food chain eats plastic, then the fish that eats the plankton will again also get plastic. And the plastic is not deteriorated in the body, so the animals will contain more and more plastic, and we will eat plastic. So of course this is a huge problem, which luckily the society all over the world is now aware of, and we have to help. All of us can help with this plastic pollution. So microplastic in the Arctic ecosystem. We look at transport and release of contaminants from plastic litter. We look at if it's plastic particles in the sea ice. We look at how abundant are plastic in the Arctic, and do plastic harm the Arctic biota, and do, of course, species in the Arctic eat the plastic and mistake it for food. So this is relatively new research field, but the solution of this is very simple. The solution is just stop throwing plastic into the ocean. So you might not need that much research actually. You should just stop putting plastic into the ocean. And the Norwegian government are talking about changing their money fueling into the Asia, and actually making use this money for having plastic places where people could throw their plastic. If you look at the world chemicals output due to emerging markets, in 2003, the world sales of chemicals, illustrated by the green bars, where for us in EU, it was higher in 2003 than in 2013. So in the Western world, we have decreased the use of chemicals, but in China, which is, as you know, a very rapidly growing economy, and maybe the third or second largest economy in the world at the moment, the use of chemicals has increased enormously. And this is actually giving the total use of chemicals on the world basis pretty stable. So China has to reduce the use of chemicals, and thereby the pollution of the Arctic and the pollution of the world to help. If you look at Ny-Ålesund, which is a research city at Svalbard, we have a station. Norway have a station where they measure the transport of pollution from Europe. This picture is taken from this station on top of the mountain, 8 o'clock in the morning, and you can see the Kongsfjord down here. Then 9 o'clock in the morning, 1 hour later, this picture is taken, and this is smog coming in from Russia. And all of this smog contains a lot of pollution, and since the temperature, air temperature in this area is lower, this will precipitate down to the ground. And then we look at how much of this pollution is taken up in the Arctic ecosystem. Another problem with chemicals put out in the Arctic is that they sometimes mimic hormones. Hormones is molecules that have an effect in the body, that can do a lot of things in the body, and they have a special structure, a special chemical structure. To have an effect, they have to attach to a receptor, which then gives the effect. The receptor is specific for each hormone. But some metabolites, some chemicals can actually look have almost the same structure as a natural hormone. And then this chemical can attach to a receptor and give an effect which is not wanted, because hormones act when they are needed. So this is another problem with the chemicals, that you have hormone mimicry. If you look at how humans challenge the ecosystems in the Arctic, it's through extremely many ways. So the ecosystem of the Arctic is threatened by transport, by tourism, by oil and gas exploitation, by minerals, humans digging for minerals, by fisheries, by new marine industries, by aquaculture, by use of indigenous and local population, which is maybe they affect the ecosystem, but this is done for thousands of years. But also indigenous and the local people start to use new techniques and new boats and methods which can affect the ecosystem negatively. You have traditional industries which are affecting the ecosystem, and you have, of course, environmental protection where people want to protect the environment. And this is changing in a direction which also is affected by climate change, globalization, and technology. So you can see that the ecosystem of the Arctic is under extremely lot of pressure from very many factors. So this is very complicated. If you look at something that has been looked upon as a problem, ocean acidification, you maybe heard about acidification of lakes, which was a problem back in the 80s. Then you had sulfur, which was released from industry in Europe, and the sulfur was transferred to sulfuric acid in the atmosphere and came down as acid rain. And this made lakes made lakes more acidic, and the fish died. Now we are looking into how the increase in carbon dioxide, CO2, in the atmosphere, which we have shown has been increasing since the 50s. This gas can react with water in the atmosphere, in the air, and make an acid called carbonic acid. This is a weak acid, but nonetheless, this acid would maybe make the oceans more acidic. The reason for this being a problem, especially in the Arctic and in the Antarctic area, is that there's cold water there. And all gases dissolve more readily in cold fluids than in warm fluids. You know this if you have a Coke in your car in a hot summer day and you open the lid, and then all the gas, which is CO2, comes out of the fluid because the fluid is now hot. So the colder the fluid, the more gas it can contain. This is also the reason why you have so much fish in the Arctic areas, because you have also more oxygen in the water because the water is cold. So in this very simple chemical equation gives you the acid, which is the proton here, and we are looking now into how can a possible ocean acidification affect the organisms, because these organisms, they are making calcareous shells, and to make these calcareous shells, they need to take these metabolites out of the water, and this is affected by the pH. So we do this by measuring, this is in the West Ice, northeast of Greenland. We measure the pH in the water by putting down water samples, taking water samples from different depths, and we analyze in the lab on the boat. And we can get an example like this, where the more red color, the more CO2, and the lower the pH in the water is. So in this area, we can see that approximately 100 meters depth, 5 degrees west, we see that there is a high concentration of CO2 and thereby a high concentration of carbonic acid and lower pH in this area. There's one problem with this research, and that is that you have a mixing of water all the time, so it's more difficult to if you measure high CO2 in this area, 2 minutes later it could be washed away. But what we have shown, Norwegian research, is that in fjords where you have still water, ocean acidification could be a problem, and we are monitoring this to see if it develops any further. Yes, I think I'm finished. So please ask me some questions now on the chat.